Hello everybody, and I've got another fantastic festive recipe for you today. This is the dessert showstopper that you're going to want to make. My gingerbread white chocolate mousse cake. And sometimes when people think mousse cake, they think, oh my gosh, it's so difficult. I'm going to demystify it and make you want to jump in the kitchen and make it. Let's get started with the gingerbread cake layers that are inside the mousse cake. So this is a traditional gingerbread recipe, and it's a 2-layer cake. So I'm going to start with my sugar, oil, and eggs. First, a little bit of brown sugar, white sugar in equal amounts, neutral vegetable oil of your choosing, and then I'm adding 1 whole egg and 1 egg yolk. Now I can separate my egg white, save that for another use. And add the egg yolk to the recipe. And I'll give this a little whisk. Making a classic North American gingerbread is easy enough to do, and what is fantastic about it is the smell of it as it bakes. And it really does get you in the holiday spirit. Break up that dark brown sugar a little bit. I know in this recipe I do ask for dark brown sugar. I'm really trying to build an intensity of a deep gingerbread color in this cake. If all you have is light brown sugar, that is absolutely fine, because we are adding both maple syrup and molasses later to this recipe. All right, but before I add the molasses and maple syrup, I want to sift in my dry ingredients, starting with my flour. And then I have a mix of spices here. I have my 1½ teaspoons of ground ginger. I have allspice, clove, cinnamon. I'm going to grate in my nutmeg, and then my baking powder. And I can add my spices. Now I'm using dried ginger in this gingerbread recipe. If you'd prefer to use fresh ginger in place of the dried ginger, what you can do is finely grate a tablespoon of fresh ginger into the wet liquid base and replace that with the dried. It's a matter of taste. I'll give this a little whisk to combine. Now the batter will be thick because I haven't added my remaining liquids yet, so don't worry about that. A gingerbread batter is notoriously runny and thin by the time you add your liquids. Okay, now I'll set this aside for just a second because this is where the gingerbread magic happens. I have a combination of fancy molasses, and if you don't have access to molasses, it is a distinctively North American ingredient. You could use a golden syrup in place of it. The molasses adds a beautiful intensity of flavor that just matches with that quantity of spices in the gingerbread. I like to even it out a little bit using a bit of maple syrup. This is a bit of an elf cake. I've got all my sugars involved in this cake. Molasses, maple syrup, brown sugar, white sugar. And I'm additionally adding ginger beer. A lot of gingerbread recipes call for using boiling hot water added at the very end of the recipe to activate the baking soda and the baking powder, because molasses actually has acidity to it, and that's what activates the baking soda I'm about to add. What I find is the ginger beer adds ginger flavor, but the effervescence of it really lifts up the gingerbread cake, so it's not dense and heavy at all. It's really light and airy. And so, as I mentioned, I want to add a little bit of baking soda. That always traditionally gets added at the very end. So I'll just give this a little stir. You can hear it and see it fizzing. And I'll add first a bit of this to loosen up my base batter, and then I'll switch to a whisk. the batter really does develop a frothiness to it. So you know it's going to be a nice fluffy gingerbread cake. I'll add a little more. While the gingerbread batter looks very light in color now, after it bakes and cools, it really takes on that molasses color, a lot richer and darker in color. And I can smell the spices in there. All right, now into the pans. This white chocolate mousse cake makes a 9-inch or 23 centimeter cake. And I want my gingerbread layers to actually fit inside. They're gonna be completely surrounded by white chocolate mousse. So I'm baking these in an 8-inch, 20 centimeter pan. So that way I have that 1/2-inch gap all the way around when I assemble the cake. And I'll pour this very fluid, frothy batter into my pans. I know this doesn't look like a lot of batter right now, but once it bakes up, it doubles in size, and it takes about 30 minutes in a 350 oven. And see what I mean about how that thin, runny gingerbread batter really fluffs up and bakes up into beautiful, level, moist gingerbread cakes. So what you want to do is let the cakes cool in their pan for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then you take them out of the pan to let them cool completely. If you're trying to get ahead with your holiday baking, you can make these well ahead of time, wrap them individually, and freeze them and pull them out when you need them. Now it's time to make the base for the white chocolate mousse. And this is an impressively simple mousse recipe. It is gelatin based, so the first thing I need to do is soften my gelatin. I've got my cool water, and to that I add my 7 grams of gelatin powder. And I'll just give that a little stir to give it a chance to bloom. You always have to soften your gelatin. If you added dry gelatin to a hot liquid, it would never dissolve. It would never absorb. It's actually not dissolving, it's absorbing the liquid around it. And that's what you need to do here is start this process, and you will see over a couple of minutes, it will thicken up a little bit. So I'm going to set that aside. The other thing I want to get ready is using a blender or a food processor is the best for making this white chocolate mousse base. I've got a high percentage of chocolate compared to the cream. So 10 ounces, 300 grams of couverture white chocolate. This comes in chip form. You can also buy the blocks and chop it up if you'd like. So I add that to my blender. And I'll set it aside for a second while I check on my cream, which, look at that, is just starting to boil. So I take it off the heat, and this is when I add and look at how this gelatin has changed. It has absorbed all that water, and this gets added to the hot cream to dissolve. You don't have to return it to the stove. The heat from the cream itself is enough. Give it a little whisk. It takes no time at all. And while the cream is still hot, I'll pour that into my blender with all of that white chocolate. Just give this a little blitz. It's wonderfully velvety smooth at this point. There we go. So now this is warm, but it's not too hot. I do want to let it set for about 30 minutes to cool down to room temperature, because the next step is to fold in the cool whipped cream. Now that my base has had a chance to cool, I can fold in the whipped cream. If your mousse base has set up and looks like it's going to be lumpy, you can just pop it in the microwave to warm it or over low heat. There's no whipped cream in it, there's nothing to be compromised. So I have all my elements ready. I have my pan, gingerbread, and now to finish the mousse, I will fold in half of my whipped cream. So of the 2 cups of whipping cream, 3/4 goes into the mousse base, and you take what's left and you whip it, and then it gets folded in. And I find the first fold is easier to do using a whisk. That way you really get that cream in there, and that first fold is so important because this is now cooling down your base. And you will find that it's a bit fluid to start, but once it goes into the fridge, it will set up beautifully. Now in goes the remaining cream. And don't forget, white chocolate already has the vanilla worked into it, so you don't have to add extra flavoring or seasoning. So the recipe for this white chocolate mousse is just so simple. But we want it to be a little bit fluid, a little bit flexible at this point as we assemble our mousse cake. Just making sure I'm pulling from the bottom. Yes, fully combined. Make a little space. Now, the interesting thing about assembling this mousse cake is you're putting it together upside down. So the top will be the bottom and the bottom will be the top. I've got my 9-inch, 23 centimeter springform pan. The bottom is lined with parchment paper. You can line the sides with parchment paper. Just grease the sides of the pan well so the paper sticks to the sides. You don't want it to pucker as the mousse cake sits. Alternatively, if you have acetate, an acetate ring means you don't have to do anything. You just line the sides of the pan with the acetate and it gives you a nice clean side to your mousse cake. Now I'm going to put in about 2/3 of the mousse into my pan, like so. And then setting in the cake is going to do all the work for me. So take one of your cake layers and remember to turn it upside down as you press it in the center of the cake, so you've got that gap. Gently press it. You don't want to press it so far that it goes right to the bottom of the pan, but just so that some of that mousse comes up the side and you can see it centered. Now the rest of the mousse gets poured on top. I love this. Assembling a birthday cake takes 3 times as long as assembling this mousse cake. And now I'll just use the cake to scooch that mousse over. There we go. And gently press this cake layer in so that the mousse comes up to meet it. This is the bottom of your cake. What I'd like to do is loosely cover this, and you want to give this at least 4 hours in the fridge to chill. A really good festive recipe means you can make it ahead, and you can assemble this cake a full day ahead of when you want to serve it. You can really see coming out of the fridge how that white chocolate mousse sets up beautifully. So now it's time for that magic moment, the presentation. Let's get this cake ready. What I'm going to do is take my cake stand, flip it, peel away the top parchment paper. So you can see how parchment paper works just as well as the acetate I have on the sides. And look at how pristine that cake is. And you've got that 2 gingerbread layers hiding underneath. For decoration, I've made my speculoos gingerbread cookies and cut out little diamond shapes. And I'm gonna go for a bit of a festive sweater effect on my cake. So these are just simple gingerbread cookies, not even decorated. And this mousse isn't like frosting. If you're setting something or putting something in place and you want to move it, you can certainly do that. If you're putting the finishing details of the gingerbread cookies on top, know that if you pop this back in the fridge, the cookies will soften up over the course of 3-4 hours. It does make the cake easier to slice. Just keep that in mind. Oh, the spices of the gingerbread with the molasses and maple, along with this white chocolate mousse, makes it a sensational dessert for the holiday season. I really hope you'll get in the kitchen, give this recipe a try, and have yourself a delicious festive season. See you again for another fantastic recipe. Mm, mm-hmm.